Behind barbed wire that glittered in the sun, German POWs sat at long wooden tables, trays loaded with eggs, white bread, potatoes, and fruit. A U.S. sergeant barked at cooks to move faster. The irony was immediate. Captives of Hitler were about to eat more, and better, than many of his own soldiers at the front. U.S. home front rationing restricted items like sugar, meat, and butter, but never overall calories. POW meals were designed to match U.S.-based troop standards under the Geneva Convention, not to exceed frontline rations. Steam rose from a Wehrmacht field kitchen outside Kharkov, 1942. Watery cabbage soup and 350 grams of bread. Men chewed slowly to make it last. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 with blitzkrieg momentum and long supply trains stretching behind them. But by 1942, the arithmetic of hunger was already catching up. German Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner had calculated generous rations for a short campaign, assuming victories would feed the army from conquered land. By the winter of 1942-43, that illusion collapsed. Supply lines were overextended, Soviet scorched earth tactics destroyed granaries, and partisan raids struck trains. What reached the front line was often late, sometimes spoiled, and almost always insufficient. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South pressed toward Kharkov with tanks under Gen. Heinz Guderian's. Heinz Guderian's armored doctrine, but even steel spearheads cannot fight without bread. The German Hersfeld-Bäckereien, field bakeries, worked furiously to bake with whatever grain was at hand. Soldiers lined up for their allotment, sometimes rye, sometimes coarse loaves padded with turnip or sawdust fillers. 1939 baseline. In garrison, a soldier's bread ration could reach 700 grams per day, meat 200 grams. 1942-43. In the East, bread dropped to 350 grams in stress periods. Meat fell below 100 grams, sometimes replaced with tins of ersatz meat extract. Caloric intake 1,800–2,200 per day under decent conditions, under 1,500 during encirclement or transport breakdowns. By contrast, the U.S. Army's rations, K, B, and C cycles, averaged 4,500 calories, double the German frontline allotments. One German diary entry noted simply, bread, 300 g, coffee, ersatz, soup thin, we fight tomorrow. It was not despair, only routine acknowledgement that hunger had become part of the uniform. Letters smuggled through censorship showed the dissonance. One infantryman wrote home, "We fight like lions, but eat like beggars." Another noted how long marches were punctuated less by gunfire than by the question of when the next bread would arrive. The Wehrmacht had once prided itself on logistical precision. In Poland and France, soldiers joked about never going hungry, but by 1942 in Russia, the joke turned bitter. The master race lived on watery cabbage soup. While German soldiers thinned on the steppe, American farms sent surpluses overseas. The Quartermaster Corps built stockpiles of Spam, canned beef, powdered eggs, enriched bread. Soldiers complained about monotony, never absence. Even civilian America, despite ration stamps, consumed on average more daily calories than the Wehrmacht could issue to its front. The irony was brutal. Hitler's soldiers, sworn to global domination, often ate worse than the prisoners they would later become. German rationing policy prioritized active combat divisions. Support units, transport crews, and prisoners within Germany received even less. But the flaw was systemic. Germany could not replace lost harvests, lacked petroleum to transport food effectively, and diverted resources to weapons first. By comparison, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps ensured that both frontline rations and base garrison rations met caloric standards that Germany could not sustain by 1943. At Kharkov, soldiers spooned out their cabbage soup in silence. Some stuffed crumbs of bread into pockets to eat during night watch. Officers knew morale was fraying. Hunger was not yet famine, but it gnawed at faith. The men did not yet know that for some, the march into captivity would soon reverse their fortunes. Within American barbed wire, their bodies would swell again with meat, milk, and fruit. The irony was already in motion. The army that had set out to enslave would itself be fed into better health by its enemies. "We will treat them as we would want our sons treated," said Provost Marshal General Allen W. Gullion, 1943. It was less sentiment than policy, a calculation rooted in Geneva law, American self-image, and hard strategy. By late 1942, the United States was not just fighting a war overseas, it was about to become jailer to tens of thousands of its enemies. German U-boat crews pulled from the Atlantic, Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia, Luftwaffe pilots forced down over Europe. Within months, they were shipped across the ocean to American soil. The numbers swelled quickly. By the end of the war, some 371,000 German POWs would be housed in the U.S., peaking at about 425,000 in 1945. They were scattered across 50 major camps and hundreds of branch sites, tucked into farmland, forests, and the edges of small towns. To Washington, the challenge was immense. To communities that hosted them, it was surreal. Enemy soldiers marched through Kansas wheat fields or Alabama cotton rows under American guard. Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War, and G.N. George C. Marshall agreed with Gullion that compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention was non-negotiable. Article 11 of the treaty was explicit. POWs were entitled to the same rations as the captor's own depot or base troops. That meant German soldiers captured in Tunisia would sit down in Texas or Nebraska to meals nearly identical to those served to American recruits. It wasn't generosity, it was reciprocity. Washington hoped that U.S. soldiers in Europe would be treated similarly. By upholding Geneva to the letter, America believed it was protecting its own. Feeding prisoners was not cheap. It cost 90 cents per day depending on camp and year. An American draftee's meals in garrison averaged 60 cents. Civilians reading the papers bristled. Why spend more on the enemy? The answer lay in logistics. POWs were fed from standardized quartermaster stockpiles, meals that had to be tallied, transported, and inspected by international authorities. Equal rations cost more in accounting, not in generosity. Menus were explicit: eggs, bread, potatoes, beef, butter, milk, coffee. Civilians on the home front juggled ration coupons for sugar, gasoline, and butter. To some it seemed upside down. Prisoners had meat while housewives scraped for points. At Camp Swift, one of the largest facilities, new arrivals from North Africa blinked at the dining hall. The building was crude. Long benches, tin trays, buzzing fluorescent lights. But the food astonished them. Bowls of mashed potatoes, slices of white bread with butter, pitchers of milk, even dessert. Officers like Cole Clifford James in the Provost Marshal's office explained the rules. Discipline was strict, guards enforced boundaries, but food would always be on time. For the men, it was a shock as much psychological as physical. They were learning that the enemy fed them more consistently than their own army had. Years later, memoirs repeated the same astonishment. One POW officer recalled, "We received meat portions, fresh milk, even fruit. It was more than I had ever seen in barracks back home." Another, writing to his family in Bavaria, described his first breakfast: bacon, eggs, white bread, coffee with sugar. The letter was censored, but the enthusiasm bled through the ink. The irony was layered. America was racially segregated. African American soldiers often ate in separate mess halls, sometimes with lower quality food. Yet German prisoners, white Europeans who had marched under the swastika, were guaranteed equality of rations by treaty. To the War Department it was compartmentalization, Geneva compliance was international law, segregation domestic policy. To later historians, the contradiction is glaring. It would be a mistake to imagine the camps as idylls. Behind the dining halls were fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers, and military police with rifles at the ready. Work details were mandatory, punishments were real, and not every guard treated prisoners with equal restraint. Reports exist of rough treatment and even shootings during escape attempts. But these were exceptions. The Provost Marshal General's office investigated quickly, conscious that the world was watching, and that American POWs abroad could pay the price for U.S. violations. Ultimately, the decision to feed and house German POWs, according to Geneva, was not about kindness. It was about calculation. Washington believed it was better to uphold the rules than to descend into the lawless brutality seen in the Pacific. If U.S. prisoners in German hands stood a chance at decent treatment, it was because German soldiers in America ate beef and butter. The men at Camp Swift didn't think in those terms. They sat in their mess hall, filled their trays, and ate in silence. But behind the clatter of tin cups and the shuffle of boots, something deeper was happening. For some of them, it was the first crack in the story they had been told about their enemies. Medical surveys at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and Camp Aliceville, Alabama, recorded average weight gains of 10-20 kilograms, 22-44 pounds, within 12 to 18 months. Outliers gained as much as 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. For many, captivity became rehabilitation. The first shock came not from the barbed wire or the guards, but from the mess hall. New arrivals at Camp Aliceville shuffled through the doors in 1943, still gaunt from Africa. They smelled it before they saw it: bacon sizzling, coffee steaming, loaves of soft white bread stacked higher than helmets. Prisoners froze in place, staring. A sergeant shouted at them to keep moving. They obeyed, into a line that ended with plates loaded heavier than any Wehrmacht ration they could remember. For men used to watery cabbage soup and crumbs of rye, the sight of roast beef with gravy bordered on the surreal. The U.S. Provost Marshal General's annual reports from 1943-45 documented a consistent pattern. German POWs who arrived underweight quickly stabilized, then began to gain. By their second year, the majority had put on between 22 and 44 pounds. Some younger prisoners, drafted in their teens, filled out into full-grown men behind wire. At Camp McCoy, medical officers tracked body mass index changes with clinical precision. Files note, POW cohort shows average increase of 18.7 PLBs after 14 months. General health improved markedly. The explanation was simple. American rations provided 3,500 calories per day, modeled on base garrison standards. The food was high in protein, rich in fat, and reliably served 3 times daily. For men who had endured front-line intakes of 1,500, 1,800 calories or less during encirclements, the effect was dramatic. Not all prisoners were nameless. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, which housed officers, a group of paratroop veterans from Crete debated what to make of the meals. Among them was Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydt, a respected Fallschirmjäger commander. He was skeptical at first, suspecting propaganda by food, but even he admitted in post-war interviews that American meals restored his strength faster than he expected. Medical detachments, such as those at Camp Aliceville, kept the records. Doctors like Capt. Albert Ritchie logged dental repairs, weight gains, and nutritional recoveries with bureaucratic efficiency. Consider the arithmetic of contrast. A German infantryman on the Eastern Front might scrape by on black bread, turnips, ersatz coffee. Caloric intake, often less than 1,800 per day. At Camp Aliceville, his captured comrade consumed bacon, eggs, roast beef, potatoes, fruit, milk, dessert. Caloric intake, 3,200 per day. The irony was glaring. the conquerors had eaten less than the conquered. Years later, POW oral histories echoed with the same disbelief. One veteran, interviewed in Bavaria in the 1970s, recalled, "I ate better in Texas than I had at my mother's table in Bavaria." Another put it bluntly, "We grew fat behind barbed wire, while our families went hungry at home." Some prisoners even joked that capture by the Americans had saved their lives, not just from bullets, but from malnutrition. The menus themselves read like a betrayal of war's logic. Breakfast might bring scrambled eggs, bacon, white toast with butter, and coffee. Lunch offered stew or cold cuts with potatoes and vegetables. Dinner, roast beef or pork chops, mashed potatoes, beans, and dessert. Apple pie, pudding, or canned fruit. Milk and coffee were plentiful. Canteens supplemented meals with candy, cigarettes, and toiletries bought with wage coupons. For men who had marched on empty stomachs, this routine abundance was disorienting. Comparisons with other Allied custodians added another layer. In British camps, which operated under stricter domestic rationing, food was more limited, still sufficient, but leaner. German prisoners in England rarely put on the same weight as those in America. The United States, buffered by its agricultural capacity, could feed prisoners to Geneva standards without straining civilian supply. This set U.S. camps apart and made letters home from America particularly shocking in the Reich. Medical files from Aliceville and McCoy, preserved in National Archives, record body weight graphs in neat pencil lines. One page shows initial weight 136 pounds, after 12 months 166 pounds. General health excellent. These were not exaggerations in memoirs. They were tracked by military doctors at the time. Such records became useful after the war when allegations arose about POW treatment worldwide. America could point to medical logs as proof. Prisoners here had not only survived, but thrived. The famous claim that all POWs gained 50 pounds is misleading. Gains varied by age, health, and camp. Older men with chronic conditions sometimes gained little. Some transferred prisoners lost weight during transit. But on average, the upward trend was undeniable. Inside the mess hall, trays clattered, voices hummed in German, and steam rose from kettles. Guards watched from the corners, rifles slung, but the tension was muted. Hunger had been replaced by fullness. The irony deepened with every pound added. Hitler's men had marched out as conquerors and starved as soldiers. Behind American wire, they ate their way into better health than they had known in years. Some prisoners whispered the thought, but did not say it aloud. Captivity was more nourishing than freedom. A work detail of German prisoners filed into Texas cotton fields, singing marching songs, only to be handed bottles of Coca-Cola by farmers during their break. The moment captured the strangeness of war. Labor under barbed wire, refreshment under a Texas sun. When the mess hall filled them, the work fields tested them. By 1943, the United States faced an acute labor shortage. Millions of men were in uniform, women filled factories, migrant labor was stretched thin. Into that gap marched the prisoners of Hitler's army. The 1929 Geneva Convention allowed POW labor, but only under specific rules. Work could not be directly related to war production. It had to be safe, compensated, and reasonably matched to the prisoner's skills or capacity. The U.S. applied the framework broadly. More than 200,000 German POWs were assigned to labor programs, harvesting crops, cutting timber, repairing roads, even working in canning plants. They were not free, but their workdays were structured, compensated, and protected by inspection. Pay came in coupons, about 70 to 80 cents per day in value, redeemable at camp canteens for cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. In Iowa, prisoners bent over rows of sugar beets, their guards watching from shaded perches. Reports show that in some counties, POW labor supplied up to 90% of the seasonal sugar beet workforce, a staggering share that saved crops from rotting in the ground. At Camp Hearn, Texas, groups marched out each morning to cotton fields, singing old Wehrmacht marches. Farmers, desperate for help, sometimes treated them with odd familiarity, shouting instructions in broken German, offering Coca-Cola or lemonade during breaks. In Minnesota, POWs worked forests and beet fields. In Iowa and Kansas, they staffed canning plants, sealing jars of food that would stock American pantries and Army messes alike. The program's oversight fell to Madge Gen Archer Lurch, who succeeded Gullion as Provost Marshal General. He pressed for strict compliance with Geneva while maximizing labor utility. Administrators like Dr. Howard B. Gill, who had a background in prison reform, experimented with structured work-motion styles, balancing discipline with productivity. Among the workers themselves were men like Helmut Gunther, remembered in camp logs for writing letters home about long days in beet fields, but also about kind farmers who treated us as men, not enemies. Over 200,000 POWs participated in work programs. Average wage credit $0.70, $90.80/day, not in cash but in coupons. Millions of man-hours delivered to agriculture. In several Midwestern counties, POW labor kept local food production at pre-war levels despite manpower shortages. After work, prisoners often returned to structured recreation. Soccer leagues were organized within camps. Theater groups staged plays. Orchestras played classical and folk music. At Camp Clarinda, Iowa, a German orchestra performed Beethoven symphonies before fellow prisoners. At Camp Hearn, soccer matches between rival teams drew hundreds of spectators. Museums and supermarkets provided food for the 150,000 civilians proud to be American. For men who had marched as invaders, the rhythm of farm labor and evening games created an odd normality. Monotony, perhaps, but one filled with calories, pay coupons, and relative safety. The contrast to German labor practices was jarring. In occupied Europe, millions of civilians were forced into hard labor with minimal rations and no protections. Soviet POWs in German custody suffered catastrophic death rates, starved, beaten, worked to death. In America, German prisoners bent to their tasks with guards nearby, collected coupons for their labor, and bought chocolate or cigarettes at the camp store. The irony could not have been sharper. Men who had enforced forced labor abroad were themselves working under humane protections they had denied others. Letters home, censored but preserved, captured the ambivalence. One prisoner wrote, "We are treated as guests, though behind wire. We work hard, but we are fed well. It feels like another world." Another noted simply, "The Americans pay us to work, and we buy chocolate." Archival reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Provost Marshal General's Office detail the POW labor contributions. One USDA bulletin in 1944 summarized, "POWs furnished essential agricultural labor in at least 30 states, sugar beet and cotton production notably sustained by their service." Wage amounts and labor shares varied widely. Some counties relied almost entirely on POW labor. Others used them sparingly. Not all experiences were generous. There were reports of harsh guards, accidents, or hostility from civilians. But the broad trend was clear. POW labor filled gaps and sustained harvests that might otherwise have failed. The prisoners knew they were not free. Guard towers watched them as they bent over cotton plants or beet rows. Yet they also knew that their labor was exchanged fairly, in calories and coupons. The irony pressed harder when they compared it to what they had done as soldiers, seizing grain from Ukrainian peasants, burning villages, forcing labor at gunpoint. Now they worked the land themselves, fed, paid, and protected by the enemy. It was an inversion of the Reich's own system, and for many, it was the moment they began to question whether the world they had been promised truly existed. How can Hitler be right if the enemy treats us better than our own? Line from a POW diary, 1944. Archival paraphrase. For many German soldiers, captivity in America was supposed to be humiliation. Instead, it began to dissolve certainty. The crack did not appear in a single speech or lecture. It spread in whispers, over breakfast tables, in barracks libraries, during soccer matches under the guard towers. The abundance of food, the fairness of rules, and the steady flow of information became a daily assault on ideology. The Special Projects Division, SPD, of the U.S. Army saw an opportunity. Headed by officers like Colin Edward Davison, the program curated German-language newspapers, organized lectures, and selected books for camp libraries. The official rationale was modest: keep prisoners occupied and reduce trouble. The unofficial ambition was larger: pry open the shell of Nazism from within. POWs found shelves stacked with Goethe, Schiller, even Thomas Mann, writers banned in Hitler's Reich. Newspapers like Der Ruf, The Call, edited under American oversight, reported on the war honestly but without the crushing propaganda tone of Berlin broadcasts. Sometimes even the voice of Edward R. Murrow, captured on American radio and replayed through camp loudspeakers, carried across the barbed wire. His calm reports from London contrasted starkly with Joseph Goebbels' frenzied propaganda. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, the SPD ran what some prisoners called the Idea Factory. It produced pamphlets in German, hundreds of thousands of them, that circulated across the camp system. Topics ranged from American democracy to German history, carefully framed to encourage reflection rather than dictate conclusions. Camp libraries grew vast. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, catalogs list more than 15,000 volumes by 1944. Prisoners borrowed novels, philosophy, even technical manuals. One guard joked, "They read more here than our own boys at college." Lectures followed. American professors and German émigré intellectuals gave talks on politics, history, literature. Attendance was voluntary, but curiosity often filled the benches. Called Edward Davison, overseer of SPD, blending psychological warfare with camp management. Hans Habe, Austrian-born writer who contributed to U.S. re-education efforts, though his role was sometimes overstated. Edward R. Murrow, his broadcasts, replayed in POW camps, symbolized free press against Nazi censorship. Estimates suggest 10 to 15% of POWs were hardline Nazis, unwilling to bend. About 25% leaned anti-Nazi, often younger or disillusioned. The majority, 60% or more, occupied a gray middle, open to influence but wary. Across the system, 1,000-plus lectures, hundreds of thousands of pamphlets, and libraries of 10,000, 20,000 books in larger camps. Not everyone was swayed. In Aliceville, a hardline faction of prisoners dismissed the American efforts as lies. One POW scrawled in his diary, "Our men grow soft on beef and sugar. They forget the Führer." But others found the dissonance too stark to ignore. A sergeant captured in Tunisia wrote home months later, "I cannot explain it. Our captors are fair. We work, we eat, we are not beaten. What we were told of them is not true." Camp logs from the SPD record attendance numbers, pamphlet distribution, and lecture summaries. One Fort Kearny report, 1944, noted, "Attendance steady at 120 per session. Topics: federal government structure, German literature in exile." These documents reveal how structured and deliberate the campaign was. The contrast with Soviet captivity was brutal. In the East, German POWs often faced starvation, disease, and death rates estimated between 15–35%, depending on the year. In the U.S., men played soccer after lectures, smoking cigarettes bought with work coupons. The difference was not lost on the prisoners themselves. Some concluded that America's system was not weakness, but strength. The re-education program did not magically convert all prisoners into Democrats. Many remained loyal Nazis until the Reich itself fell. Others played along for privileges without changing convictions. Post-war surveys show mixed results. The impact was real but uneven, and memory often magnified it. The irony was sharp. Hitler's men, sworn to despise democracy, were softened not by bullets, but by libraries, lectures, and roast beef. Each meal eaten without fear, each book read without censorship, each fair rule enforced consistently, it all gnawed at the edifice of Nazi ideology. The cracks widened quietly, in whispers in the barracks, in scribbled diary entries, in long pauses before answering the question, what if everything we were told was wrong? Ink smudged across a page as a German prisoner wrote by lantern light, describing peaches and cream served that week. If the meals fed the body, the letters fed disbelief. Every month, millions of handwritten lines crossed the Atlantic, carried through the channels of the International Red Cross. Censorship loomed over every page, but certain truths leaked anyway. Food, health, the odd kindness of guards. For families in Germany, the words were both a comfort and a wound. The system was rigid. Regulations allowed 2 letters and 4 postcards per month for each POW. All correspondence passed through camp censors, then the Red Cross clearinghouse, often via Lisbon or Geneva, before trickling into the Reich. Transit time was slow, 3 to 6 months on average. Some letters never arrived. Others were bundles of old news by the time they reached Bavaria or Saxony, yet even delayed, the messages carried weight. The operation was overseen on the American side by officers like Cole Clifford James of the Provost Marshal's Office. International oversight came from the IRC postal channels. On the receiving end, German families sometimes found themselves under the gaze of Gestapo censors who opened foreign mail. Among the senders was a prisoner remembered in archives as Wilhelm Weber, who wrote repeatedly of bread with butter every morning and meat more often than holidays at home. His letters, preserved in fragments, became evidence of how news of abundance spread. Millions of letters and postcards exchanged, 1943-45. Average allowance, 2 letters plus 4 postcards/month. Transit, 3-6 months, typical. Camp censorship offices processed thousands weekly. IRC logs note bundles of 10,000-plus letters leaving U.S. camps in a single shipment. Archival POW letters survive in both U.S. and German collections. One letter from Aliceville in 1944, partly censored, reads, "We have milk with every meal. I am healthy again. Do not worry." Another, intercepted in Germany, was flagged for defeatist tone because it praised American fairness. For families in the Reich, these words landed with the weight of betrayal. A mother in Dresden later recalled, "I could not believe my son's words of plenty. We stood in ration lines, hungry, while he wrote of peaches." Some relatives distrusted the letters, assuming they were propaganda forced by Americans. Others whispered the opposite, that the regime had lied about everything. Compare the tone of Wehrmacht field letters with POW letters. From the Eastern Front, no bread for 2 days, soup only, turnips, send what you can. From Texas, I ate beef today and fruit, I am gaining weight. One line radiated scarcity, the other surplus. Both were written by the same army, months apart, under different skies. Not all letters told the full truth. Censorship scrubbed references to camp conditions beyond food and health. Letters were delayed, lost, or rewritten. Families often received fragments. but enough detail slipped through to fracture illusions. For Nazi propaganda, the letters were poison. Berlin's papers thundered that American camps were brutal, that German sons were starved and beaten. Yet the words arriving from across the ocean described butter, milk, fruit, and evenings of soccer. The irony deepened. Letters written by captives undermined the Reich more effectively than Allied leaflets dropped from the sky. In dim barracks, prisoners sealed envelopes and handed them to guards. Months later, in dark German kitchens, mothers unfolded the same sheets and read of milk and meat. Between those smudged lines lay the collapse of a story, the realization that the world their sons described was not the one they lived in. Bremerhaven, 1946. Train doors slammed. German prisoners stepped onto home soil. Heavier in body, hollow in faith. The war had ended, but captivity lingered. German prisoners remained in U.S. camps well into 1946, long after Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender. For the men, repatriation meant not only freedom, but confrontation with a homeland unrecognizable. They traveled in reverse, out of the mess halls of Texas and Alabama, onto trains guarded by MPs, then to Atlantic ports. From Camp Swift to New York Harbor, from Aliceville to Boston, they boarded Liberty ships and troop transports bound east. On deck, they felt the salt spray for the first time in years. For many, it was a return to uncertainty. Medical officers logged their condition before departure. Many men left America weighing 10 to 25 kilograms more than when they had arrived. Their skin was clear, their teeth repaired, their bodies restored. Few armies in history had sent prisoners home in better shape than they had been captured. Gen. Dwight D. Eisenhower, then U.S. Army Chief of Staff, oversaw broad repatriation planning through the Office of Military Government, U.S., OMGUS. Konrad Adenauer, not yet Chancellor, observed in 1946 that returning POWs were a destabilizing yet necessary element of rebuilding society. German officers like Wolfgang Langewiesche, later author and journalist, recorded the dissonance of returning stronger than their own families. Total German POWs repatriated worldwide, 5 million. From the U.S., 3, 171,000, shipped back in waves 1945-46. Civilian rations in Germany, 1946, 1,100, two's the calories/day in many zones. Hunger winter of 1946-47, potatoes rotted in fields, bread stretched with acorns and beets. Mortality rates in Soviet captivity, 15 to 35%, depending on period and cohort. U.S. POW death rates, under 1%, mostly illness or accidents. At Bremerhaven, prisoners disembarked into a country flattened by bombs. Cities were rubble. Trains rattled through landscapes stripped bare of bridges and factories. Families waited on platforms, gaunt and hollow-eyed. One former POW remembered stepping onto German soil with a duffel over his shoulder. "I came back heavy. My family looked gaunt. The shock was physical. Their cheeks were round from Texas beef. Their sisters' faces were sharp with hunger." Reports from the Allied Control Council and OMGUS documented German civilian nutrition. Typical rations in 1946 fell below 1,200 calories/day, sometimes less in winter. A council report noted, "Children show signs of stunting, adults unable to maintain work capacity." By contrast, POW medical logs recorded repatriates with restored weight, some even exceeding their pre-war health. Soviet returnees told another story. Men who had survived Soviet captivity trickled back, skeletal, broken, or not at all. Death rates from starvation and disease remained brutally high. Against this backdrop, those returning from America seemed to glow with health. One German civilian noted bitterly, "The men from America looked like well-fed cattle. The men from Russia looked like ghosts. U.S. custody, 3,300 daily, calories, weight gain, medical care. Soviet custody, starvation diets, high mortality, slow repatriation, stretching into the thousands, 950 S. The comparison was not merely nutritional, it reshaped political attitudes. Men who had lived under American rules, however unwillingly, often carried back a grudging respect. Not every American returnee stepped off ships robust. Transatlantic crossings were harsh. Some lost weight at sea on restricted rations. Others found conditions in holding camps in Europe less generous than those stateside. Weight gain statistics varied by camp and cohort. The broad pattern, however, remained. Prisoners came back better nourished than when captured. The irony cut deep. Soldiers who had marched into battle as proud conquerors had been restored to health by the very enemy they had sworn to destroy. They returned not to victory parades, but to ration lines, not to triumph, but to ruins. For many, the ideological collapse was total. If the Reich had been right, why had the enemy treated them better than their own? One man wrote in his post-war memoir, "I had believed we were chosen, destined. Yet I returned from America ashamed. The enemy had shown me fairness. My own people gave me hunger." It was not universal. Many clung to old beliefs, but enough men voiced similar thoughts that historians later traced a subtle thread. The POW experience helped seed West Germany's eventual democratic turn. Not all returning POWs embraced democracy. Some reintegrated bitter, others politicized. But the broad nutritional and moral contrast between American and Soviet captivity became part of post-war identity. In Adenauer's West, stories of fair treatment circulated. In East Germany, stories of Soviet brutality were suppressed. The train doors closed again, this time to carry men inland. They carried duffels, Red Cross parcels, and extra pounds on their frames. Behind them, barbed wire and beef dinners were memories. Ahead lay hunger, rubble, and the hard work of rebuilding. And with every step, they bore the irony of having been fed into health by the very nation they had once vowed to destroy. Decades later, German veterans told schoolchildren, "We were prisoners, but we ate like kings." The war ended, the camps emptied, but the memory endured. For thousands of German soldiers, their years behind American barbed wire became a story they retold long after the guns fell silent. In post-war Germany, people compared scars. Men who had returned from Soviet captivity spoke of starvation, beatings, endless years of forced labor. Men who had come back from America spoke of steak, soccer matches, and books in the library. A less interesting but almost equally the contrast was so stark it became folklore. Former POWs described their time in Texas or Kansas not as suffering, but as nourishment, physical and moral. Children grew up hearing their fathers joke, "The best years of the war were in an American camp." Arnold Kramer, historian of POW life, collected dozens of these stories in the 1970s and 80s. Norman T. Kirk, U.S. Surgeon General, had overseen medical policy that ensured POW health. Individual veterans like Friedrich Kapp, featured in oral histories, described the irony with candor. "I gained 20 kilos in Texas, while my family at home lost the same." Today, sites like the Camp Hearn Museum in Texas and the Camp Concordia POW Museum in Kansas preserve the story. Exhibits display trays from mess halls, soccer balls from recreation fields, and letters describing meals. At Camp McCoy, a small exhibit still interprets the experience. These reminders underline the strange truth. America had turned barbed wire into an unlikely school of democracy, fairness, and even gratitude. Only 2 major U.S. POW camps maintain museums today: Hearn Concordia By 1950, U.S. expenditures on POW feeding, housing, and repatriation reached tens of millions of dollars. Oral histories collected in the 1970 S90S reveal a consistent theme. POW alumni often reintegrated into West Germany faster than peers, citing skills learned and respect gained. Oral history transcripts preserved in German archives, U.S. museums, and Kramer's monographs capture the voices themselves. One veteran recorded in 1982 recalled, "They conquered me with food, not with bombs." The memory of American captivity fed into West German admiration for U.S. abundance, while East Germany, under Soviet control, silenced such comparisons. In the West, former POWs often became advocates for transatlantic partnership. In the East, silence was enforced. Memory is selective. Not every camp was pleasant, not every guard was kind, and not every prisoner left resegregated. Some resisted, some suffered discipline, some carried bitterness. The story of gained 50 pounds was a simplification. Health outcomes varied. But as a collective memory, it stuck. The irony outlived the war. What bullets and bombs could not do, bread and butter sometimes accomplished. Ideology cracked not under interrogation, but over trays of mashed potatoes. By the time these men became grandfathers, they told their families a story of unexpected mercy. That defeat had come not only by fire and steel, but also by food and fairness. Behind the barbed wire, America had not just imprisoned its enemies, it had fed them into health. And in doing so, had planted seeds of doubt that outlasted the Reich itself.